Hey Silver Tubers, it's Mr. Zeke coming to you from the Silver Pouring Bench. I'm doing a response to a question that was asked by a subscriber and a friend, North Country Off Grid. Great channel, neat folks. We're actually in the midst of doing a project with them. They asked what was the purpose of using a torch while pouring silver or gold. And there are several different reasons for using a torch. One popular use is for the folks that don't have an electric furnace. They will use the torch to melt the silver in a whip and crucible like this. And it does take a pretty hot torch to melt silver. MAPP gas usually, if you're using a smaller torch. There are several different size torches. This one you see here on the bench is the big one. This is the big dog. It runs off of actually an air propane torch. And it runs off of a barbecue grill size canister of propane. Then I have a smaller one that runs off of, what you would expect. It's kind of tangled up behind the bench. This one runs off of the smaller Coleman propane canisters, and this is it has less of an impact. It creates less heat. This larger one creates about as much heat as a MAPP gas torch or the furnace. But there are a lot of different uses for using a torch. One would be to melt the silver if you were using a ceramic or porcelain mold. Another is to heat the actual mold. Depending on the complexity or simplicity of the mold, a simple bar mold doesn't have to get that hot to accept the silver and get nice smooth edges around it as you pour into it, as we're going to do here. The more complex the mold, though, I have found, and remind yourself, this is just a guy playing in his garage, by no means an expert, but this is a pretty complicated mold with lots of tiny little crevices, and this is the Tree of Life mold. And I have found that the closer I can get this mold to the temperature of the liquid silver, the easier it is for the silver to flow into all those little crevices and give me good detail on the surface of the pour. Now you can't get a mold too hot. It's kind of a fine balance. Another use that you will find the torch used for is to create those ever so popular cooling lines on the back of the piece. So the part of the silver that's face down in the mold usually takes the shape of the mold, but the surface that's facing up, exposed to the air, cools and creates lines in that. And you'll see some on some of the older Engel hard bars that you can tell were poured versus cast. And that's one of the primary differences that you can spot over time as you really get into this, is a cast bar versus a poured bar. Because typically a poured bar is going to have some sort of cooling lines, because the silver typically cools from the outer edge inward, and so you'll get those concentric rings around the outer edge of the circle. So what we're going to do tonight, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to use a small mold, and I'm going to pour one with the torch on there to create the rings. Because what we're doing with the torch is we're trying to keep a certain portion somewhere in that pour hot enough to keep the silver liquid to draw those rings over to that one spot. And then we'll pour another one with no torch. We'll keep the torch on it, but we'll shut it off before we'll pour it, and we'll see how that affects the cooling of the silver on the back of the pour, back being the, if you want to call, like in coin terminology, if you want to call the part that's face down the obverse, or the front, the reverse would be what's facing up into the air. And so let me get that mold nice and warm first, because the torch is also used to heat up the mold. Sometimes I will take, if I have a thinner mold, this is kind of a thick mold. If I have a thinner mold, like the Tree of Life, I'll simply set this on top of my crucible upside down. As the crucible heats up, the mold heats up. So we're going to stop this right now, and we are going to heat up this mold, and then we're going to pour one with the torch flaming on the pour as I pour it, and you'll be able to see the effects of that torch on that. So hang tight. Alright, and we're back, and I apologize because the torch does add some noise, background noise, which is why I do most of my melting in my tabletop furnace, because it's electric and it doesn't, you know, create much background noise. And the silver's molten. Now, one of the things you need to be aware of when using a torch is you're not going to want the torch that close to the pour, because it will actually create a pitting effect on the silver, because part of that, what's coming off of that torch is oxygen, and that oxygen will get forced into the silver, creating a pitting. So we're going to turn this down. We're going to turn it down to about like that, and we're going to back it off a little bit, but you're still going to be able to see the effects. And let's aim this torch, we'll aim it towards one end. But you're going to see the effects in the pour. I'm going to zoom in. It's kind of a small pour. This is really just a 1 ounce pour, and the effects are exaggerated the larger the pour. But you should be able to see some of the effects of that torch, the flame on there. And if you're new to pouring, you really want to avoid the little, when you use a torch, usually at the tip at the farthest point from the flame, from the torch, you'll see those little spits, those little white spits. You really want to avoid those, because those will also cause pitting. So let's go ahead and pour this with the torch on it, and you should see some movement in the silver as this is going into, and I hope I can capture this. That had a lot of, this particular crucible I had coated in a material, and that material is wanting to slide off now, so there, we'll put that back in there. Okay, and that had a lot of schmutz in it, but I'm going to do that again and try to get some of that schmutz off of there, because I really want you guys to be able to see what takes place with, and that's probably still too much torch, so this video may go a little bit long, and I do apologize, so hang tight. Alright, I chose a little bit bigger mold, added some silver, because I wanted you to get a little bit better effect. I'm going to turn this down a little bit, but I'm going to leave it right where it's at. And so you can see that the torch is blowing into the mold. So what that should do for us is it should create some lines in the silver, cooling lines, if you will. They've been called all kinds of things. I know Backyard Bullion refers to them as ripples. He does a lot of, all his pours are pretty much ripple pours. And he uses a torch to create that effect. So let's have a look and see what happens here. Try to keep my mitts out of the way. And you can see the silver moving around. Okay, so that's a good example. I'm going to recharge the crucible here so we can do one without the torch. But now, if I take the torch off this pour, Oh, I'll just shut the torch off. If I take the torch off this pour, dump it out, and cool it off so we can handle it. I don't want to pull a hi-ho and pick up a piece of hot silver and try and dry it off with my shirt. Yes, I remember that. So now if we look at this, we're going to see all that activity on top of the loaf we just poured. And that activity was caused by, in that center right there, that's right where the torch was pointed. So it kind of drew all those lines into that point, and that's typically as a hand pourer where one would stamp their logo, covering that divot in the bar, or in this case just a loaf ingot. And the torch on the mold before you pour can also help create those air bubbles to give it the more authentic look on the back. So I'll be right back and we'll pour one without putting the torch on the mold. Alright, silver tubers, so now we're going to pour into a mold that does not have a torch on it. And I've used this 1 ounce bar mold here. It's a little smaller because I'm running out of silver to melt here. So let's see if we can get a clean pour. That's my biggest concern. I don't want to overfill it. So use my leverage there. I kind of went over a little bit, but I think for the effect of what we're going for here, we ought to be able to see, dump it, cool it. I know this video is running incredibly long, longer than normal, but so now we have a bar that we didn't apply the torch to, and we get a lot of stuff going on. It's a lot less controlled. We've got some rough edges. We've got much longer what you would call faster cooling lines, but they're not as consistent if you compare the two. This one has, get it in front of the camera, let me zoom out here. There we go. This one has very controlled cooling lines. And this one just has, well, just all kinds of mess going on. So the torch can be used to control the look of the top side of the pour that faces out. And sometimes without a torch you'll just get a smooth pour depending on how big the pour is. So I hope that helps illuminate some uses of the torch. Obviously there are many uses for a torch. But in the meantime, it's Mr. Zeke coming to you from the Silver Pouring Bench, trying to answer some questions. Cheers, everybody. Oh, if anybody's interested in these bars, let me know, because otherwise they'll just get melted back down. I think this one in particular would really look nice once it's all stamped up. So, cheers, everybody. Mr. Zeke from the Silver Pouring Bench on a Wednesday evening.